Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm not joined again by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who had some other matters to attend to this week. Hopefully he'll be back next week. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for around 33 years now of principled, uncompromising perspectives on the libertarian philosophy. And subscribe to our FFF Daily, which is free. We've strived to make that the best libertarian commentary page on the internet on a daily basis. It's kind of like a op-ed editorial page every day that comes into your email box. And we got a monthly journal, Future of Freedom, which we've published for 33 years. That's by subscription. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Tune in on our Libertarian Angle. We post that in our FFF Daily every week. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to address one of the burning issues of our day. I know we've addressed it before, but I want to address the concept of open borders in the primarily in the perspective of the police state that open borders has brought into existence. Now, every libertarian, I think, opposes the concept of a police state. Why? Well, for the obvious reason. A police state is contrary to a free society. Libertarianism is about freedom, right? So it stands to reason that libertarians and libertarianism stand opposed to a police state. But that's exactly what the system of immigration controls brings into existence, a police state. Now, a supporter of immigration controls might say, well, I support immigration controls, but I oppose the immigration police state. But that's like saying, I support lightning, Jacob, but I really oppose thunder. You see, because thunder comes with lightning. So it's impossible to separate out the two. And the same thing applies to a system of immigration controls. It comes with a police state. So it makes as much sense to say, I favor immigration controls, but I oppose a police state, as it is to say, I support lightning, but I oppose thunder. Now, before we get to the specific aspects of this immigration police state, let me preface this particular segment of Libertarian Angle with a couple of comments on the perspectives that some people have about the concept of open borders. One perception is that under open borders, anybody will be allowed into the United States. See, and as soon as you hear that word allowed, it should send off, alarm bells, because libertarians don't think in terms of allowed and permission and so forth. Freedom doesn't come with permission. As the Declaration of Independence points out, freedom is one of those inherent, natural, God-given rights. And a right doesn't need permission. Let's take free speech, for example. It's not that the government is allowing you to criticize the government. That's not the point of all this. I mean, I can imagine there's people that said, oh, thank goodness the government is allowing us to have free speech. Well, once you start thinking along those lines, that the state is giving you permission to exercise free speech, you've gone far beyond the concept of rights. Rights, as Thomas Jefferson pointed out in the Declaration of Independence, they're natural, they're inherent, they're God-given. They precede the government, they precede the state. They exist independent of the state. In fact, as Jefferson points out, the purpose of government is to protect the exercise of these pre-existing rights, these inherent rights. So it's not a matter of the government allowing people freedom of speech. We libertarians don't think about that. You have a right of free speech that exists independent of the government. Even if the government didn't exist, you'd have the right of free speech. Well, so the same thing applies in the area of immigration. Either somebody has a right to cross a border or he doesn't. It's not a matter of, well, maybe should the state allow more people in? Well, as soon as you start thinking that, then you're disclosing the fact that you don't believe that people have a right to cross borders. Now, one interesting aspect of that, of course, is the domestic borders here in the United States. You very rarely hear advocates of immigration control saying, isn't it wonderful that the federal government and the state governments allow us to cross borders, state borders, without checking on us or demanding that we show identification and so forth. I mean, and that's a good sign that they think in those kind of terms. And the reason is because we've all been born and raised under this system of open borders, and that's what we have here in the United States. We have a system of open borders. We don't generally talk about it like that because we're all accustomed to it. It's been part of our life since we were born, and for 100 years, more than 100 years, a couple 100 years or more. People are free to cross state borders without asking for permission. Nobody's allowing people to cross these borders. People have a right to cross these state borders without any kind of governmental interference at all. And every day, people cross borders, back and forth, state borders, county borders, school board borders, city borders, freely. And nobody's keeping count. Also, there's no telling how many dangerous people are crossing borders every day. For example, here, the border between Maryland and the state of Virginia, for most of it is the Potomac River. Every day you go out there and you just see countless cars coming in from the north through Maryland and crossing the border into Virginia. Same thing in the opposite direction. Thousands upon thousands of cars moving, crossing the border from Virginia into Maryland. Nobody's keeping track. These cars could be including terrorists, people with COVID, burglars, thieves, rapists, murderers. I mean, there could be anybody. And yet, we accept this as simply a part of a free society, that people have a right to cross borders. That's the position. And it's not a matter that, the Constitution allows us to do this. No, our rights don't come from the Constitution. Our rights are inherent. And the reason people are free to cross borders here in the United States is because it is an inherent right to cross borders. And I think even most advocates of immigration controls and America's system of immigration controls would agree with that. Because I very rarely hear them saying, well, we should continue allowing people to cross state borders. I think if they were pressed, they would say, no, it's not a question of allowing. People have a right to cross these borders. Now, it didn't have to be that way. I mean, if you take the reasoning of the immigration control advocates, you could apply it on a statewide basis. You could say, well, look, why not have each state be able to erect controls on who enters the state? Suppose I make that argument. Suppose I say, look, we need to know who's coming into the state of Virginia. I mean, it could be terrorists coming in. It could be murderers. Some years ago, there was actually some snipers that were coming in from Maryland and killing people over here at random. They were just shooting people. That type of thing could happen. And so I could theoretically make the case, well, we don't want those kind of people in Virginia. What's wrong with just checking people, doing background checks on everybody that comes into Virginia? So we establish a control station there on the Potomac. And as soon as people cross the river, the Potomac there, coming into Virginia, they've got to stop at the inspection station where they have to produce identification and maybe be subjected to a quick background check their car to make sure they're not doing any bombs, check their health condition to make sure they're not bringing in COVID or the flu or measles or whatever. What would be wrong with that? So there'd be a backup. But, I mean, isn't that worth keeping everybody in Virginia safe? Well, why shouldn't every state be able to do that if you apply the reasoning of immigration control advocates? All the arguments that they use for people coming in, let's say on the southern border, apply on a statewide basis too. For example, they say, the whole world would come here. We need the immigration controls, Jacob, because the whole world would come to the United States. Okay, let's apply that reasoning to New York. The entire country, the whole country, could move to New York City tomorrow. You can't deny it's a possibility. And we know how overcrowded New York City always is, so we can't take a chance like this. We've got to establish a system of immigration controls on New York's border to prevent people from going into New York. Other Americans, you see, we need that checkpoint there, and we need a quota system to ensure that not too many people move into New York or New York City. So all the arguments they apply on the international borders apply to state borders as well. But I would argue that to allow the states to have immigration controls would be a disaster. You'd have the same kind of police state that would be forming that you have in the southern border that I'll talk about in a minute. And you'd be violating people's right of freedom of travel. Now, like I said earlier, if either people have a right of freedom of travel or they don't. If they don't have a right of freedom of travel and freedom of association, that's another fundamental right, economic liberty, freedom of contract, then they don't really have it domestically either. I mean, if international checkpoints or international borders are no different from state borders. It's just a border separating an artificial line, a political line that separates two nations rather than two states. But the principle remains the same. People have a right to cross borders. It's just that since we haven't been born and raised under that kind of system where people are free to cross international borders, it all seems like, oh my gosh, Jacob, the whole world would collapse. The United States would fall into the ocean and so forth. It's just something that we're not accustomed to. Now, our American ancestors were accustomed to it. They weren't scared of the United States falling into the ocean if you had open borders, for example, on the southern border, because they lived with open borders on the southern border for more than 100 years. People were free to cross back and forth and back and forth. It was no different. The mindset was no different from people crossing back and forth between Virginia and Maryland, Texas and Oklahoma, and so forth. People from Mexico crossing over, going back, people from the United States crossing over, coming back. It was just a fluid situation that people were born and raised under. So they didn't freak out like wake up and say, oh my gosh, there's open borders here. Oh my gosh, the United States is going to fall into the ocean. I mean, nobody has that reaction when they wake up and they say, oh my gosh, people can come into Virginia from everywhere. The terrorists, the Muslims, the communists, they can come into Virginia. We need checkpoints on our borders. Nobody does that. And nobody in the 19th century did that either with respect to international borders, because we had a system of open immigration during that entire period of time. But since we haven't been born and raised under that kind of system, none of us question it. The same applies to the whole welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, welfare, and so forth. I mean, you suggest that these programs should be abolished, and everybody freaks out because this is what they've been born and raised under. But if you go back to America, for the first 125 years or so, where they didn't have these socialist programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and so forth, they weren't shocked that they didn't have socialism because that's what they had been born and raised under, a free market system based on voluntary charity. Same with the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. Everybody freaks out whenever I say we ought to dismantle the national security establishment and restore a limited government republic. The statists freak out because they've been born and raised under this system and they can't imagine anything different. But if with a system of open borders, it would be the same thing as it is between Virginia and Maryland. The decades-long immigration crisis would be over immediately, overnight. People now freely crossing back and forth, just like between Maryland and Virginia. They retain their citizenship, just like people in Maryland retain their Maryland citizenship, and people in Virginia, likewise, they leave the state. Everybody retains his citizenship. If he wants to apply for American citizenship, fine. But that's a whole different concept of just freely crossing back and forth. Nobody would care because nobody would know who was a citizen or not. I mean, you don't know when you're interacting with people whether they're from Maryland or North Carolina or Texas or whatever, unless you ask them, or, oh, where do you live and where's your residence? But that very rarely comes up in conversation. And the same thing applies to foreigners here domestically. When you meet somebody that speaks with an accent, you don't ask them to see their papers. You might say, where are you from? But you don't ask them, are you here legally? So that's exactly what would happen immediately with open borders. The concept of open borders domestically would be no different than on the southern border. People crossing back and forth fluidly without seeing this police state that I'll address in a minute. Well, let me get to that right now. Okay, this is what we have now. I can speak with some authority on this because I grew up on the border, and I spent close to half my life on the border down in Laredo, Texas. So, I'm familiar with border culture. It's a totally different culture than the rest of the United States. But I grew up on a farm on the Rio Grande. We irrigated out of the Rio Grande and irrigated our crops and so forth. And we hired illegal immigrants. They were the hardest working people I've ever known. And they were there to make money. I know what, immigration control advocates, or some of them say, oh, they're just coming over here to get on welfare. I have never met an illegal immigrant. And I represented them as a young lawyer when I went back. I practiced law for 12 years, as some of you know, in Texas. And I represented lots of illegal immigrants and never met one that came over here for welfare. They all came over here to work. Now, at that time, it was legal to hire illegal immigrants. In one of their comprehensive reform packages that they enacted, they made it illegal to hire illegal immigrants. This is part of the police state, that you can't hire who you want to hire, no matter how hardworking they are. And they have immigration raids on businesses where they've made it a felony, where they prosecute American businessmen for hiring illegal immigrants or knowingly hiring illegal immigrants. And they thought that was going to solve their little crisis that's been going on since I was a kid. It didn't solve anything. It just added to the police state they have. Now, it's important to keep in mind that they have the authority, the Border Patrol has the authority to enter into any farm or ranch along the border. And when I say along the border, I'm talking about like 100 miles from the border. The Border Patrol can just enter into anybody's property, despite the Fourth Amendment, that says you need probable cause before you conduct a search. The Supreme Court says, well, no, Jacob, this is the border. Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to the border, Jacob. And the border's 100 miles from the border. That's what they've held. 100 miles from the border is the border. So the Border Patrol can go in just anybody's farm or ranch and search around. And they did in our farm. If we put a lock on our gate there at the main highway that led into our farm, they'd shoot it off if we didn't give them a key. That's their authority. If they found illegal immigrants working on our farm, which they did, they just would seize them, put them into their van, those pea green vans, and cart them away and deport them. And if they caught them a second time, they charge them with a felony. This is what a police state's all about, warrantless searches. But unfortunately, all too many civil libertarians just have sealed lips. They don't want to talk about this grave violation of the Fourth Amendment because they favor immigration controls. They favor this socialist system. And immigration controls is a socialist system. It's no different from any other type of socialism. It's based on the concept of socialist central planning. That's a core principle of socialism. And is it any wonder why there's chaos? Ludwig von Mises called the results of central planning planned chaos. It's a perfect description of the immigration situation we have along the border and have for decades, ever since I was a kid. All right, there's also highway checkpoints. This is also part of a police state. I've been to Cuba, which I think every one of us would acknowledge as a police state. And they have highway checkpoints. You're driving along the highway, and all of a sudden, right there is they've set up a checkpoint to check people's papers there and to search their vehicles. So that gives you a pretty good idea of that this is a police state measure if it's in Cuba. Well, they have the same thing here in the United States. If you leave Laredo, for example, on IH-35 and you head north, you come over a crest of a hill after about, 35, 40 miles, and you're hit with a surreal sight. You're hit with an immigration checkpoint station. And for a minute, you think, oh my gosh, I'm in Mexico. I'm coming to the border. because it looks like an immigration checkpoint that you see at the international border in Laredo. And so if you do a U-turn and cross back and go south on I-35, man, the lights will come and they'll come and catch you. But you go to this checkpoint and they can do a search of you there. They demand to see your papers or your identification. Usually, if you're Anglo, they just wave you on. But if you're dark-skinned, they're gonna question you. And if you're in an old vehicle, they're gonna really question you. And if you speak with an accent, which many people in Laredo do, you better have your papers with you. You got to have your passport with you or your driver's license, including the passengers, because they're going to demand it. And then they're going to say, "Get out of your car and open your trunk." They're gonna search your trunk. And if they're suspicious of anything, if they find drugs, they're going to arrest you there and turn you over to the DEA. If they're suspicious or whatever, they point you over to a side little station where they conduct a more extensive search. All this is inside the United States. This is not crossing the border. This is 40 miles north of the border. So people who live in Laredo or people who have just visited Laredo and never crossed into Mexico have to be subjected to this kind of checkpoint. That's what a police state's all about. To be able to stop people on highways arbitrarily. And it's not only traveling north of the border. You go into the American Southwest and you can be on interstate highways that are run east-west and run right into these same checkpoints. And so they're just stopping cars that are just traveling within the United States. This is what an immigration police state does. Remember, these east-west checkpoints are even worse because you know that people aren't coming over from Mexico directly. They're just traveling east-west. This is how Willie Nelson, for example, the country music singer, got caught with drugs. It was at one of these immigration checkpoints. So this is what a police state's all about. Now, they also have roving Border Patrol checkpoints. And it's not really a checkpoint, it's just a roving Border Patrol stop. That any Border Patrol really has full unfettered authority to stop whoever he wants. That there are so many exceptions to the search and seizure, probable cause, reasonable suspicion, that for all practical purposes, they can stop whomever they want. And they do. If they think that a car is riding a little bit heavy, they'll pull it over, because there could be illegal aliens in the back or bales of marijuana or what have you. I myself was a victim of this type of police state action. One weekend, when I was in high school, I was traveling to the beach, and all of a sudden I was by myself, and all of a sudden the light turns on. I looked. I thought maybe I'd been speeding or something, but no, it was a Border Patrol. And so I pulled over. He was by himself. He gets out and he comes over and he says, "Open your trunk." And I said, "Well, why'd you stop me?" And he didn't respond. He just says, "Open your trunk." I mean, these guys are really arrogant. And I said, "Well, you don't have authority to look in my trunk." And he says, "Don't you know the drug problem we're having along the border here?" And I said, "Well, you have no jurisdiction in the drug war. That's the DEA. You're Border Patrol." And because I was in high school, I had longish hair, and he figured, oh, well, this guy's probably taking drugs to Corpus Christi or something where I was headed, or Port Aransas, which is near Corpus Christi. And so I said, "Well, you don't have the authority." He says, "Look, you either open up your trunk here or we take you back to Border Patrol headquarters and open it up there." Well, I should have just gone back to headquarters, but my friends were waiting for me at the beach and so forth. So I got out and opened the trunk, and of course he didn't find anything and let me go on my way. And I later learned, because one of my best friends in high school's father was head of the Border Patrol station there in Laredo, that it created quite a furor when the guy went back and reported what he had done. But this is what it's like living under a police state where they can just stop you whenever they want. And it doesn't matter whether you're innocent or not. That's not what freedom's based on. Where they allow you to travel and so forth. That's not freedom. Freedom is the unfettered right to travel without being stopped by any police officer unless he has what the law calls probable cause that you've committed a crime. Now, there's also the police state also involves laws against transporting illegal immigrants. So if they see your car and you've got some dark-skinned passengers. Be prepared to be stopped because they're gonna do that, and it also involves harboring. So you can't have illegal immigrants sleeping in your farm or your ranch, because they're going to charge you not only with hiring illegal immigrants but also harboring. So you can't help them, even if they're starving to death, and even if they're dying of thirst, you can't help them. And an example of this phenomenon took place a few years ago, maybe a couple years ago, where in the American Southwest, there's immigrants that are dying regularly because of thirst and dehydration, because the clampdown is so strong that that's one of the areas where they can still make it across the border. But by the time they get to a populated area, they're dying of thirst and dehydration, and some of them don't ever make it, and they find their bones out there in the desert and so forth. But there's a group out there that puts out water jugs just at random, so that if these people find them, they can drink them. And the Border Patrol hates that. I mean, they go in there and they find these water bottles and they empty them. Because they don't mind people dying over there. Their position is that'll deter more people from coming over. Well, it never does, because you never think you're going to be the one that's going to be dying of thirst. But another group headed by this guy out there actually gave food and water to a group of illegal immigrants, and I think they may have spent the night there in this building that he has for this purpose. I'm not sure. But the feds went after him with a vengeance. I mean, this is just a super no-no to help immigrants that are dying of thirst in the eyes of the Border Patrol. And they had him indicted, and the U.S. Attorney's Office actually prosecuted him. And they, got him in front of the jury and said, "Look what a horrible thing this guy did. He helped illegal immigrants. We've got to stop the illegal immigrant invasion of America," and so forth. And lo and behold, the jury, in a classic case of jury nullification, found the guy not guilty. It was just fantastic, but that didn't dissuade the U.S. Attorney's Office. They said they were going to continue prosecuting people who did this. One of the hypocritical parts of all this system that a lot of Americans don't know, but people along the border know, is that a lot of people in the border towns hire maids and gardeners that are illegal immigrants. And the Border Patrol knows this, but they rarely enforce the laws against housewives that hire maids and gardeners and so forth, because there's this unspoken rule that we don't want to jack around with the local populace here, because they'll raise a fuss, and a political fuss, and they'll make things difficult for us. So there's sort of the modus vivendi that has been developed. I don't know if it's still the same way, but it was when I was growing up. Is the Border Patrol never touched any family that hired a maid, a nanny, or a gardener. They decided that for political reasons they weren't going to do it, which really goes to show you how hypocritical the whole system is. Now, they also board buses, Greyhound buses, and demand people's papers. And we had a nanny growing up in Laredo, and she never learned English. She spoke only Spanish, which a lot of people in Laredo do. When we would do a jury selection and jury trials, when they bring the jury pool in, I would estimate that about 20 to 25% of the jury panel would be disqualified because they couldn't read or write English. I mean, this is part of the culture of a border town. And so our nanny sometimes would go north on the bus to visit my brother or sisters up in San Antonio or Dallas. And so they stop them there at that checkpoint, and they board the bus, and they demand to see everybody's papers. So she would have to carry her passport with her. She didn't drive, and so she didn't have a driver's license, but she had to carry her passport. And if she didn't, which she didn't one time, they don't let people continue on their journey. They take them back and until they can produce records. They might even deport them. They've even mistakenly deported American citizens that just couldn't speak English or write English. They don't believe them. You see, when they say I'm an American citizen, they don't believe them. They think their documents are falsified and so forth. One guy told me on a plane flight out of Laredo one time, he was Mexican-American, and he told me, he says, whenever I'm leaving Laredo, I dress nicely and I carry my passport because I know they're going to be questioning me. I mean, this is what it's like to live in a police state. You've got the Berlin Wall down there, Trump's wall, but before that you had the fence. but now that's their dream, a Berlin Wall. And I say Berlin Wall because that's really what they want down there. Now, the Berlin Wall was very effective in keeping people from crossing over into East Berlin and into West Berlin and into West Germany. That's what they want here. They want that same kind of wall. In fact, sometimes I say I wonder whether they're unhappy with the fact that the Berlin Wall was dismantled. I mean, it seems like they would have been better off just moving it over to the southern border. I think they would have been very happy. But in order to construct that Berlin Wall, they've got to steal people's property away from them. So people along the border, like us, ranches and farms and so forth, through eminent domain, they just take their property and to construct this wall. And in many instances, the engineering aspects of it are that they have to build the wall further away from the river. And so the person's property is separated by the wall. So he's got part of his farm on the other side of the wall, adjacent to the Rio Grande, and then the other side on the other side of the wall. This is all like a police state down there. You've got the forced deportations where people are separated from their families. They catch them and they immediately deport them. There's no saying goodbye to their family or anything like that. All of a sudden, the family's wondering why their father or husband didn't come home that day. Well, it's because they were caught and they were deported. And then of course you've got the incarcerations, and I saw those firsthand, of course, as a lawyer. When I went back to Laredo, as a young lawyer, I walked into the federal judge's office. I made an appointment, and I asked the judge to appoint me to represent illegal immigrants for free. And I wanted to challenge the whole system for unequal treatment. I mean, it's an arbitrary, vicious, malicious, tyrannical system, and the judge agreed to do that. And so, as part of that representation, I'd go out to the detention center and interview clients and so forth. And these were the nicest, most humble people that you'd ever meet in life. They just would walk around with kind of dazed looks on their faces, like, "What are we doing here in jail? All we wanted to do is just get a job." In what had previously been their country. I mean, when the United States stole the northern half of Mexico, and that's the only way you can describe it, is a theft. When President Polk started the Mexican War, that the idea was, everything will be United States and there won't be any problems with stealing the northern half of Mexico. Well, how do you steal the entire northern half of a country and keep all the citizens? Because every Mexican citizen that was living on this side got to be American citizens automatically. And so their culture is Mexican, Spanish, to a certain extent French. They all spoke Spanish. That was their national language. Their laws were Spanish. In Laredo, many of our streets are named after Mexican heroes. Iturbide, Zaragoza. A lot of them are named for Mexican heroes. I mean, how could it be otherwise? This was the northern half of Mexico. Now, Texas's history is a little bit different because Texas had won its independence before the Mexican War. But still, it was all part of Mexico, and the thought that this would not have ramifications is ridiculous. I mean, imagine if we went in there and stole the southern half. Well, that would solve the illegal immigrant problem, at least for Mexican illegal immigrants, because they'd all be American citizens. But I guess people, thankfully, I think most immigration control advocates would not advocate starting another war, ginning up another war with the aim of taking over the rest of Mexico. But that's culture along the border, and I've seen it. Like I said, I've been there I lived close to half my life down there. And I've lived under this immigration police state, especially when it's combined with a DEA. You go into Laredo and it's filled with DEA agents, Border Patrol. You can find them all at Denny's or at some donut store there, Dunkin' Donuts or whatever. And then there's all the deputy sheriffs, and there's the federal agents, the marshals, and the U.S. prosecutors. I mean, it's an incredible thing. And a lot of the DEA agents, you don't know are DEA agents. I remember when I was first practicing law, I went to a bar one night, and I was just having a beer, and I struck up a conversation with a guy, and he says, he asked me what I did. I said, I was a lawyer, and I said, what do you do? And he says, well, I'm a salesman. I said, oh, really? I'm so naive. I said, what do you sell? And he goes, just a salesman. And I said, oh, okay. And so we chatted for a while, and then I took off. And about, I don't know, 6 months later, there he is in federal court testifying in a case. He was an undercover agent. And the guy looked like a bum when I met him, but it was a perfect cover. And that's the thing. That's what it's like living in a police state. Is that you don't know who's a government agent, and who's trying to catch you, and who's trying to entrap you and induce you so that they can go and bust you up on something. In any event, so that's what it's like to live under a police state. That's what comes with immigration controls. There's no way to separate it out. That if you favor immigration controls, despite your protestations and whatever, you automatically are supporting the concept of an immigration police state, because like lightning, it comes with the territory. Thunder and an immigration police state, they come with lightning and they come with immigration controls. That's my report here on the Libertarian Angle this week. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks for your great support of FFF, and I look forward to talking to y'all next week.